This is going to be a surprisingly short video, at least I hope, but I cannot understate the magnitude of some of the changes proposed here today. This is an update to the balance patch, or the proposed balance patch, from a few weeks ago. The 8-worker start, the rework of Warp Gate, and a whole bunch of other changes. We're adjusting some major parts of that, and some other things as well. And if you want a more long-winded version, I'm going to be streaming pretty much all day on this channel. Yes, day. Look at me. I'm a vampire. But that's how excited / concerned / interested I am somehow all at the same time. And I'll actually be playing the game. Unlike, well, I'm glad you like to watch. So like, subscribe, and let's dive in. Larva spawn rate increased from 10.7 to 9 seconds. Larva have been untouched since the beginning of StarCraft 2. It was 15 seconds in StarCraft time, which translates into 10.7 seconds in real time. So, the consensus among mostly unbiased players on all sides, Zerg got screwed the most by 8-worker start. You might be like, well, Larva gives them an advantage. No. The difference is that when other workers were at 12 workers on the new patch, Zerg was also at 12 workers with 0 larva to get there. For reference, on the live server, Zerg has 12 workers with 3 larvae to start. So essentially, they start the game a couple steps behind just to get back to where they were. On top of the fact that, well, Queen's costly and Overlord's obscenely slow. Actually, ridiculously slow. There was no way that was going to stay. But Queen mineral cost decreased from 175 to 150, back where it was. Ew, it's about time. Cliche, Brent. I know. So, there's no 2, 3, 4 ways to slice this besides pretty massive Zerg buffs. And for the last 16 years, we have... I mean, the Zerg in me, I'm 1/3 Zerg myself, is unbelievably excited. I've already played a little bit just to test it out. This is insane. So, to be clear, this does not affect spawn larva. Spawn larva is from the Queen, which every 30 seconds you can use the Queen to slap 3 energy into a hat, or 3 larvae into a hatchery. It pops off. That is the main mechanic with which Zerg get more production. But this is, I think the math works out to about an 18% increase in larva production from hatcheries. So this brings hatcheries into, and hatcheries are still 275 minerals. So that means Zerg, just in general, from the start of the game to the very end, will be getting 18% faster larva from hatcheries. You're still capped at 3 larvae per hatch. But this is a buff to Queens, a buff to Overlords. They're still slower than they are on the live patch, to be clear. But for reference, in Wings of Liberty, at the 6-worker start, Overlords were the equivalent of 0.82 speed. So putting them at 0.7 made them even slower than Overlords with an 6-worker start. That's relevant because the Overlord speed is being nerfed. At least ostensibly, we don't get an explanation. Because being able to scout at the same time when everyone else's builds are slower is an advantage. So now instead, it is 0.85, which is very slightly faster than the equivalent in Wings of Liberty. So that is a buff to the old one, but still a nerf compared to the current. But the larva change, and the Queen minerals, obviously, in many ways, well, that's a revert. But the larva spawn rate is just a straight-up buff. That's a buff to macro hatches. It's a buff at the beginning of the game. It's a buff at the end of the game. It doesn't give you necessarily more larva in the super end game when you're usually banking larva anyway. But that is a lot. And as someone who has struggled to find Zerg enjoyable in the early game for about half a decade, when did Cyril start winning things? I don't, but crazy. But we're not done. Unit warping time slowed from 3 to 4 seconds, but all warpins are now 4 seconds. Warpgate research has been reverted to be researched on the cyber core. Well, it's technically called the cybernetics core, but we're all friends here. Warp gate cost on each individual warp gate is now 25-25 from 50-50. And various train time adjustments, because now it provides a 40% boost up from 35%. And Disruptor Phantom weapon attack range decreased. So the Disruptor has a fake attack where if you A-move the Disruptor, it now will pretend to attack. What that means is it won't just wander into the enemy because it doesn't have one. So it doesn't get a water balloon or a slime ball like the Infestor does now. But instead, it no longer wanders to its death, which is a buff in most cases. But it was so far off that before, the Disruptor would be at the very edge of its firing range with the Phantom attack. I feel like we could just give it a water balloon if we're doing that, instead of making it pretend to attack, but not important. It's kind of a buff to Disruptors for most players, though it is a little awkward to use if you're used to actually microing them. Shield battery energy set to 75. Okay, this is gonna, I think I'm just gonna get through these changes and then we'll look at this, which is the unofficial yet community effort to actually make the changes readable. So, these are the changes as a whole, including the last patch, and what has been changed and what hasn't, including the starting workers. So we're just going to run through that in a moment. But shield battery energy set to 75. So, the way the shield battery works now is if you warp it in near a nexus, it starts at 100 out of 100 energy. It's also, fun fact, one of, if not the only unit/building that doesn't have 200 energy. So it's already very special snowflake in and of itself on that. But second, at 100 energy near a nexus, and outside of a nexus power field, say an offensive cannon rush or something, set to 50. So that was the kind of compromise. Now, if you saw Hero versus Clem, which I cast not long ago, and if you haven't seen that, I desperately implore you to watch. You'll know what I'm talking about with Hero using a Nexus to power up shield batteries to do some aggressive strategies. That's what he was using to enable that. The shield battery being 100 energy near a Nexus. So this is overall, I call it a slight nerf in most use cases, since most of the time you're building shield batteries near a Nexus. But a slight buff to offensive shield batteries, so take that what you will. And Ghosts are straight up nerfed. Damage reduced from 20 to 15. And then movement speed reduced by... technically... that is what, like 3%? I don't know what unit it's now slower than or only slightly faster than, but I assume there is one. Because that's a pretty specific number and it's such a tiny percent. But it is a nerf. And I'm not going to dwell on this because I've already talked about it at length. But the reason I haven't really been focusing on games in the last patch, or in the first version of this patch, is because some of the bugs were quite literally game-breaking. The orbital command granted 2 supply for free. Because it's not a command center and was not treated as such. It was still on the old patch supply. This was, in my opinion, a build order / game-breaking bug that's doing a disservice to Terrans as well, by making their builds easier in an obvious bug. It took 3 weeks to fix this. And that is my biggest concern before we get into it with all of this, is it took 3 weeks to fix something that literally broke every single game with a Terran in it. Maybe not by a lot, but when we're talking about the 8-worker start and early game economy, and taking 3 weeks to fix a single number, I don't love it. Also, the fact that Vipers could not abduct siege tanks, which was kind of a huge part of a nerf to Terran in the late game. To compensate for the buffs to the Ghost, which still exists. So most of those bugs seem to be fixed, which is good. We'll see what new ones crop up. But let's get a full rundown. I'm not going to go I will go line by line, but I'm not going to dwell on the ones we've already talked about if they haven't changed too much, besides the starting worker count. We reduced from 12 to 8, slightly increased the mineral patches or mineral patch resources and Vespene gas. at each base, meaning that you can stay on potentially one base for longer, whichever base it is. So, in my opinion, this does not create more early game strategic diversity and doesn't reduce the likelihood of players kind of just turtling to 200 supply. In fact, in many ways, it exacerbates it, though we'll see if against Zerg that's still true, because the larva buff is a lot. And I want to take this time to, I don't know what sort of fallacy it is to talk about it like this, like we're creating strategic diversity when we see new builds and strategies. There's going to be crazy games, wild games, ridiculous cheeses. Many of those could have and do still happen on the old patch that have nothing to do with the worker count being changed from 8 to 12. We're doing so many changes. At the same time, something is bound to look crazy and strategically diverse. And if we had a reliable method of changing the game every, say, 3 months, then I'd be almost 100% for it. I still wouldn't like some parts, but the simple fact that it took 3 weeks to change basic numbers that broke the entire patch, and it takes about 8 months to get a new one at the minimum, maybe longer, I am very concerned that many of these changes may be very interesting for 1 to 2 months, and then players whose literal job it is to figure it out will do so. And I want to come back. Now, I've talked about Zombie Grub's video on... she breaks down why the... So we had these conversations about lower worker start versus higher worker start. Guess when we had them? 2015. Because of the debates of 6 versus 12 workers going into Legacy of the Void. And there is a wide array of mathematical breakdowns and reasoning why it doesn't necessarily, one, make it harder to cheese. In fact, the arguments at the time were that cheese is stronger because you have more workers, which means it's less commitment. So, on one hand, the first patch says we want more strategic diversity, and we do that by lowering the worker count. But we have plenty of evidence that the same is not necessarily true on the other side. But I think one of the things that sticks out to me, as someone who didn't play Brood War, who enjoys it on occasion, but like many of you, would not necessarily play the game, but instead just enjoy to watch, is the fact that workers are super dumb in Brood War, and you are incentivized to expand because your workers are so dumb. In StarCraft 2, your workers are not dumb. You can get, with 47 workers, I don't know why that's a specific number, probably because of Brood War. It's because workers will reliably pair, and their AI is leaps and bounds smarter than it was in the Brood War. So you can, with great reliability, have 16 workers on each base, and that is just as good as having 8 workers spread between twice as many bases. Unlike in Brood War, where if a worker jostles a shoulder with another worker, they have a little fucking slap fight, sorry, pardon my French, for a while until they figure out if they're mining at all. Because that's part of the strategic diversity of Brood War, is telling each individual worker to mine, so that way you can have 3 wrist surgeries in order to win championships by the age of 25. But I love watching it. But I do think StarCraft 2 is too smart sometimes for its own good. And it's a incorrect comparison. But I digress. I said I was going to keep this short. Last one was an hour. This won't be an hour. We have the stream. All right, make sure to check it out today. Anyways, where were we? So, the 8-worker start. Now, I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea, but I don't think it will do anything of... The idea that it's going to change the game and the builds and the strategies, and that's what's going to do it, is at best misleading, and at worst just purely unscientific because of all of the other changes we're doing. So, what are the results? The Ghost now does less damage against Zerglings. Not Banelings. Banelings are not light units. But instead of 10 plus 10 versus light, it was 20 with the new patch and now down to 15, which is a nerf against many units, and the movement speed reduced. Still, snipe cannot be interrupted, and though it costs more energy. Subgroup priority was adjusted. Oh, apparently Marines and Marauders are no longer the same one, which was a good change. Larva spawn rate now increased on top of creep, spreading and receding slower, which in my opinion is mostly a buff. The mineral cost of queens reduced from 170 to 175 to 150. Spore crawlers buffed against mutas. That's what that is. Carapace, 50-50 less. The Infestor now has an auto attack. Microbial Shroud doesn't need an upgrade. It can be cast from long range. So the Microbial Shroud still competes heavily with Infestor energy. And if you're auto attacking with Infestors close enough to the enemy, they can be targeted very easily with EMP, snipe, feedback. But it's better than walking into siege tanks most of the time, even though they're still way outranged by them. It is a buff, as is abducting siege tanks. And then Overlords, nerfed to 0.85 speed. Mutas seem to be a little better about prioritizing. I'm still not 100% sure the effects of Arc Slop. I haven't seen anything comparing them side by side, but it is a functionality buff. The Warp Gate research, we're still going with Warp Gate costing per gateway, which is a big nerf to Warp Gate in general, and completely changes all builds. And it appears that Nexus supply reduced from 15 to 12 was intentional, which is the biggest nerf to the early game. Now, after Warp Gate is done, Zealots, Stalkers, Sentries, and Adepts, well, Zealots, Stalkers, and Sentries specifically, will all train faster than Marines out of gateways. You might be like, Winter, don't be ridiculous. You can't train Marines out of gateways. Not with this patch, but... So... that is very fast. But is it faster than just warping them in? Is the cost 25.25, which is half of what we were testing? The fact that it's back on the Cyber Core. So putting Warp Gate on the gateway was a big nerf to Protoss because now you had to choose heavily between early game units and whether you have access, like just access, the privilege to upgrade Warp Gate. So this brings us a lot closer to the live version, but still significantly different. We will see. It's definitely less dramatic. And in many ways, well, not in many ways, but in some ways it is a buff. As all warp-ins are now 4 seconds, they don't need to be in super pylon fields. Though this is a very slight buff by 0.4 seconds to Warp Prism warp-in and super pylon warp-in. There's a whole bunch of bug fixes that hopefully are all going through correctly. An issue where auto turrets did not receive Terran structure armor. Slight buff to the Raven here in the bug fixes. But, okay. So, there's no two ways about it. This is now a big buff to Zerg. How big? I don't know. But, well, one, we're reverting the Queen, but the larva cost is certainly... I mean, the larva time. This changes every single build. Not even like an interpretation. This completely has a lot. And now, as someone, I can tell you, and if you've watched it all, anyone outside of Serral struggles to make Zerg feel like it isn't just getting bullied for the first 6 minutes of the game, and then you either all in, or you continue to do so until maybe you can punch back eventually. And not to oversell it, this is still just 3 larvae per hatch. This isn't like they magically get more larvae, but I am more interested to see macro hatches. I think macro hatches are already heavily underutilized, especially because queens have so many jobs that they can't always be injecting. I feel like Zerg is going to have a resurgence for at least a time. Will it be too much and will be figured out and not get figured out and Zerg is just too strong? This is the biggest buff to Zerg because it's from the 0-second mark of the game. Before, like, building a queen, not the 0-second mark. Carapace upgrades, not the 0-second mark. But every single larva, and the most important larva, is now about 18% quicker. The math seems right. So, make sure to check out the games I'll be playing and casting. I like to think I play at a decent enough level to experience the changes while also being relatable. It's just a nice way of saying I would get destroyed by anyone you watch me cast 100 times out of 100, but I might be able to survive long enough to make it look a little difficult. We'll see. But it is the first set of changes, really, that make me feel a little excited to try out Zerg, as opposed to just seeing if I can survive long enough to get beat by Skytoss. So, and make no mistake, these changes will not help Zerg. Like, say we're in a set-piece battle. We're late game. You've seen it. You see it every day. It's 8 base Zerg against 6 base Protoss or Terran. 200 supply, money in the bank. It does not help Zerg there, really. Microbial Shroud a little bit, abducting siege tanks a little bit. But the chances of Zerg being in a better position to get there and having more initiative, so that way they can play that more Zerg-like style instead of reverting to nickel and diming and the bean counter phase, it's more likely they'll be able to get an advantage going into the late game over players who are just turtling on a limited amount of bases. It doesn't necessarily help them in a direct engagement, but over time, it's the effects from the very start. It's the economy. And that's one of the many things we're talking about. And it's going to be impossible to point to one thing in particular. And I think it's a total fallacy to say this is the change that needs to go, or this is the change that needs to stay. But doing the 8-worker change on top of all, or underneath, really, all of this, is wildly reckless. But also very interesting. So I hope it makes your day, whether you're playing or watching, at least a little bit better. I hope to see if you got questions or you want to watch some games. Well, you're already in the right place. So thank you for watching. And we'll keep track of things as time goes on. I'm interested. You have my attention. Hope I made your day a little bit better. See you next time. Good luck, have fun. Stay chill.